You're entering Corsi
We're going to do a deep dive today on my new book, just out, which is The Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism and Anarchy, Exposing Woke Insanity in the Age of Disinformation. It's showing how the woke movement developed out of communism, and neo-communism in particular, which is, I'm going to explain how neo-communism came to be. It's really a revision of Marx's theories. Then cultural Maoism, the revolution, the cultural revolution that Mao had in China, and the tactics that they utilized. And it's very important to go back into the history of this, because the woke live in a different phenomenological reality. That means they see the world differently. They perceive that the world is entirely subjective, and therefore we have to posit the utopian values that we want to live into. So it's John Lennon, imagine a world with no God. Imagine a world with no boundaries. Wouldn't it be great? We would all love each other. We wouldn't fight. We wouldn't fight over religious wars. We wouldn't fight over nations. We could all live as one. Why don't you join us? You may say we are dreamers, but we're not the only ones. You can be part of it. It's all nonsense. It's all an imagination of a utopia, whose message is to destroy capitalism, destroy what exists, destroy what works, destroy God. We just get beyond all these things, we'll be free. That these are things that enslave us. It's like going back in political philosophy to Rousseau. We're all born free, but we are living in chains because of civilization, because of the need to work, because of capitalism, because our labor is being misappropriated by those who have the money. Okay, now the problem is that the capitalist system is free enterprise has been the most productive system human beings have ever devised. It allows for individual incentive. It allows for reward of success. It allows for production of wealth, the rise of a middle class. It's why the left hates it, because they can't be in power. They can't be the oligarch who controls everyone, who determines what you can think and what you can't think, what you can eat and what you can't eat, how you can travel or not travel. It's why the woke generation is embracing the climate change movement, because it's control, government control. You're the outcast. You need thought reform. Well, these things all come out of communism and its redefinition that occurred when the original Marxist theory failed. How did the original Marxist theory fail? Well, Marx had predicted in 1848, he was seeing that there was going to be revolutions in Europe, and these revolutions, he believed, would create a communist state. Well, they didn't. The revolutions occurred. Workers got more rights. Ultimately, in the 20th century, it built into labor unions, and there was no workers of the world uniting. So therefore, communism, starting with Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist who was imprisoned between the two world wars, and wrote notebooks in the prisons, which are largely ramblings, but he identified that we should attack the culture of capitalism. That's the new definition. Now, we're going to focus today on a secret speech that Khrushchev gave in 1956, because in terms of when you look at communism, everybody thinks communism is being a unified one thing. It's not. There was an original definition that Marx had, what this revolution would involve, and it changed over time. There's even differences between the young Marx and the older Marx. It's a complex subject. But in 1956, February 25th, 1956, Khrushchev gave a speech that demolished the reputation of his predecessor, Josef Stalin, detailing the horrors of Stalin's rule and attacking this cult of personality. Now, this also impacted Mao. Mao modeled himself on Stalin, and Mao felt personally threatened by the de-Stalinization, because if Stalin could be toppled by Khrushchev, his successor, well, then Mao could be toppled by those who followed him, and his status diminished because Mao knew he'd caused massive famine and the Great Leap Forward. Millions of people starved of starvation in his collectivization efforts. Then the Cultural Revolution, which destroyed all of the culture, the traditions, literature, philosophy. Anyone who wasn't a Red Guard youth with a little red book going around saying, you've got to be woke, you've got to be with Chairman Mao, we're gonna indoctrinate you. Then that whole generation of education, tradition, history, Confucianism, Taoism, all got erased from China. It was intentional destruction. Now, this speech that Khrushchev gave was on the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev assembled a secret session in the Grand Kremlin Palace, which was the Moscow residence of the Russian Tsars. It was a 4-hour speech without interruption. Now, the communists are used to do this. I mean, these are marathons. Khrushchev detailed Stalin's purges that involved the torture and execution of wholly innocent party loyalists. The communists, when they come to power, always eliminate those who got them to power. They want to consolidate the power. They don't want any rivals. If the New World Order group from the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates took over, first thing they would do is get rid of the woke because they don't need any more disruption. Now the disruption was only useful to destroy capitalism. Once that was accomplished, they do not want the woke turning on them. So they eliminate the woke. Stalin executed party loyalists because he was threatened by them. So Khrushchev proposed peaceful coexistence with the West. And Mao saw this as a betrayal of the principles of revolutionary communism. Instead of living with capitalism, Mao felt he wanted to destroy the United States. Parenthetically, what Khrushchev demonstrated was that Marxism, Leninism might have successfully put the communists in power. Still, by pursuing a policy to reduce Stalin's importance, Khrushchev was abandoning the leadership of a global communist revolution to protect the interests of Russia as a nation state. Khrushchev's attack on Stalin, Mao saw this as a risk to his rise of power at the head of China, another nation state, and an opportunity to launch a second revolution. What Mao did is he launched the Cultural Revolution in order to reinforce his position, whereas Khrushchev wanted to embrace a peaceful coexistence with the West. Mao concluded that this move, the Cultural Revolution, would both preserve his power as head of state in China and advance the country over Russia as the leader of the global communist revolution that he, as a dialectically trained Marxist-Leninist, felt was inevitable. Okay, now this is I want to read one more paragraph from this decoder who did several books. He's on Mao, and he writes, in communist parlance, after the socialist transformation of the ownership of the means of production had been completed. In other words, now you have a situation where you own nothing and you're happy. A new revolution was required to stamp out once and for all the remnants of bourgeois culture from private thoughts to private markets. Just as the transition from capitalism to socialism required a revolution, the transformation from socialism to communism demanded a revolution too. Mao called it the Cultural Revolution. By launching the Cultural Revolution, Mao caused a fundamental re-examination of the global communist revolutionary movement. Again, Decoder wrote, the great proletarian culture revolution was the second stage in the history of the international communist movement, safeguarding the dictatorship of the proletariat against revisionism. The foundation piles of the communist future were being driven in China, as the Chairman Mao, guided the oppressed and downtrodden people of the world toward freedom. Right. Mao is the one who inherited, defended, and developed Marxist-Leninism into a new stage, that of Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Okay, so while the Cultural Revolution was aimed to raise the dialectic Marxist-Leninism to a new level, the Cultural Revolution was a disaster for China, being a nation state. And we'll cover that in a minute. But here I want to show a couple things with Khrushchev and Mao. We have a clip of this, of a news broadcast of this speech. Chris, can we play that?
Gathering in the Kremlin, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party springs a surprise on the world. Josef Stalin, the man who ruled Russia for a quarter of a century, is publicly criticized for the first time. The critics include Premier Bulganin, his predecessor Malenkov, and Party Secretary Khrushchev. Khrushchev and his colleagues tell the delegates that for 20 years the party has suffered in all its work from one-man rule. Now, they announce, collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy is promised. The official history of the party, largely written by Stalin, is judged unsatisfactory and is to be rewritten. Other Stalin writings, until now above reproach, Khrushchev and his colleagues describe as scarcely helpful. Most startling of all, many old Bolsheviks are said to have been wrongly condemned as enemies of the people. The world waits to see what these strange developments will mean.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And so what it meant was that Khrushchev was determined to pursue peaceful coexistence with the Dwight Eisenhower administration, but Mao accused Khrushchev of abandoning the goal of achieving worldwide communism, claiming that China now had taken the lead in the Marxist-Leninist ambition to produce communist revolutions aimed at destroying capitalism in all countries around the globe, including the United States. So in 1997, this Roderick McFarquhar and Leroy B. Williams, who was a research professor of history, political science at Harvard, they published together The Origins of the Cultural Revolution. And in that book, they observed that the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, which Khrushchev's secret speech triggered, prompted Mao to challenge whether Khrushchev was competent to act as to set the ideological guidelines for the world communist movement. And that book wrote that book on the origins of the Cultural Revolution by two Harvard professors. By 1960, Beijing and Moscow were engaged in a bitter polemic over the range of national and international issues, and Khrushchev abruptly withdrew thousands of Soviet technical assistance personnel from China. During the early 1960s, as relationships worsened, Mao pondered how to avert a similar betrayal of the revolution in China. Mao ramped up China's involvement in world revolutionary struggles of international communism, filling the vacuum created by Khrushchev's thaw in relations with the United States. Mao also decided he needed an offensive strategy in China to ward off internal rivals positioned and ready to use Khrushchev's attack on Stalin to launch a similar attack on Mao. So that's when the Cultural Revolution began. And the whole nature of the Cultural Revolution was destructive. Now, I'm going to, yes, Chris got on the page. I just want to interrupt this quickly to again mention, I'll get a copy of this book, How the Coming Global Crash Will Lead to a Dramatic Historic Gold Rush. As we pointed out, we are now seeing gold trading at over $2,000 an ounce. And I think we're going to continue to see that rise into 2024. And you get a free copy of the book by calling Swiss America at 1-800-519-6268. The book is How the Coming Global Crash Will Create an Historic Gold Rush. And the toll-free number to call, 1-800-519-6268. You can also get from Swiss America 250 of these Walking Liberty half dollars, which are very high in silver. It's a one-time offer for new customers, introductory offer. You can buy up to 250 of these coins at virtually what they're worth in silver. It's a loss leader for Swiss America. But I'm encouraging you to put some of your resources, especially your retirement resources, into gold, because I see for coming in 2024 is going to be a very rocky year economically, and the stock market could be down significantly. Again, the Biden administration will try to hold things even keel and win the election, postpone the economic downturn until 2025, but I'm not sure they're going to be able to pull that magic act off. We've got too much debt in the world, and the mortgage market is right now stagnant and crashing, and the commercial real estate market's going to follow. We have too much debt in the world, and debt always leads to an economic correction. This could be extremely severe. Okay, now let's resume this. What the truth is that Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, the revolution was followed by a reign of terror, both in Russia and in China. So, like Stalin, and I'm reading and going through one of the major important sections of this book about the truth about neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and anarchy. The point of the book is to expose woke insanity in this age of disinformation. It's not necessarily an easy book to read. I go through the political philosophy and the phenomenology, the philosophy that led to the Hegelian dialectic, which is the key motivating drive of this neo-Marxist left. You have to understand the Hegelian dialectic, the need to destroy in order to create the utopia, which is felt to be an historical inevitability. It's very mystical thinking, but if you do not grapple with this, you're not going to understand how the woke are living in a schizophrenic world, which they expect everyone to respect their bizarre gender definitions. They don't want to see male, female. They don't want dichotomies. They don't want good and bad. They want all kinds of shades of gray. And we're not going to beat it unless we know how to expose that what results from this thinking is like malware of the brain, because the end result is anarchy. It is complete disaster. So the climate change movement is the disaster engine of the woke generation. And what they want you to do is eat bugs, not fly airplanes, end nitrogen fertilizers, kill billions of people. That's okay with them. People are useless to them anyway. There's no God. There's no family. It's, uninhibited, unbridled love and free love and sex, really, because love is not the issue. It's sex. Just sex is the liberating factor. Marcuse, in his book Eros and Civilization in the 1960s, Frankfurt School established that principle. That's where communism ends up. Now, Khrushchev's speech even disturbed William Foster. Foster was a communist in the United States who would write the Soviet states of America. And Foster had to admit that Stalin made mistakes that were appalling, but he continued to support Stalin and for his rule in Russia. Foster reduced himself to a very predictable rationalization that Stalin consistently followed a generally correct political line, and he performed great services in advancing the Russian and the world revolution. Same things were being written about Mao. That's William Foster right there. He was writing books in the 1930s. And by the 1950s, he was approaching the end of his life. So there was a book published in France in the late 1900s called The Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, and Repression. That book did is it swept Europe, became an international bestseller. It was an 858-page book. I have a copy of it in my library here. The documented that whenever communism gained power, the Marxist, Leninist, Maoist governments committed horrific crimes, including terror, torture, censorship, suppression of dissent, famine, deportations, and massacres, all resulting in millions of deaths. The authors also credited Khrushchev's communist leader 1956 secret speech as a turning point. For the first time, a high-ranking communist leader had officially acknowledged, albeit only as a tactical concession, that the regime that assumed power in 1917 had undergone a criminal deviation. The authors of this book, The Black Book of Communism, acknowledged that Khrushchev's complex motivations for delivering the secret speech included advancing his career after Stalin's death. Those listening to Khrushchev's secret speech were stunned by what they were hearing. Black Book of Communism authors stressed that the delegates listened in absolute silence. There was polite applause, as you saw. There's the Black Book of Communism. The first secretary of Russian Communist Party, as such, Khrushchev systematically dismantled the image of, quote, the little father of the people, the genius Stalin, who for 30 years had been a hero of world communism. Now, in his 1970 book, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler, The Age of Social Catastrophe, historian Robert Galately presented a perceptive analysis of Lenin. He described Lenin as the, quote, most intransigent practitioner of Russian Marxism in the pre-revolutionary period. Galately defined Lenin's power politics in historical terms. Quote, it was precisely his will, Lenin's, to power that drove on the doubters among fellow Bolsheviks in 1917. Without a hint of moral scruple or sense of national loyalty, Lenin desperately hoped that Russia's defeat in the First World War, he hoped for that, and he ridiculed fellow Bolsheviks who thought they could and should defend their country. When the 1917 revolution came, Lenin was in Switzerland. Emboldened that the czars had been toppled, Lenin returned to his homeland. He was determined to destroy what remained of the old social and political order in Russia, and intent on killing any chance that the new Russia would become a liberal democracy. Lenin, within days of the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia, Lenin insisted that civil rights had to be curtailed. He had little sympathy for the common people. He felt that if left to their own devices, the peasant farmers and the industrial working class would merely want better wages, trade union demands that would preclude the need for a real revolution. Here's how Galately summed up Lenin. Leninism was based on the idea that professional revolutionaries would form an avant-garde or vanguard party and rule in the name of the proletariat. They would not waste time on the sham of liberal democracy, which they regarded as nothing more than the government of the hated bourgeoisie. Getting rid of the absolute monarchy and replacing it with a constitutional system was merely a prelude to a more authentic revolution. None of this was going to happen without bloodshed, and Lenin took it as self-evident the class struggle meant civil war. He was convinced that communism had to be forced through violently. His followers were elitist to the core and assured of their own superiority. They took it upon themselves to create a new world order from top to bottom. Again, this is central to understanding what communism is. It is at heart an oligarchy, a small group of people. They destroy their rivals. It's internally extremely difficult because it's whoever's the leader, whether it's Stalin or Khrushchev, they're always worried about being deposed or killed. But Stalin was Lenin's logical error. Stalin justified every zigzag in policy, every turn of the screws, this is Galately again, every dose of terror by tracing it to some statement or other that Lenin had made. He took exception, so Galately understood that the truth that was open when the Soviet archives were open was that Lenin was the most extreme of the radicals, the leader who pressed for terror as much as, or probably more than any. The reality is that the Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideologies share the characteristic of being psychologically powerful perversions of language promising utopia that have proven to be highly successful in toppling the existing regimes. What precedes the revolution are promises of utopia. What follows the revolution is a living communist hell. Stalin, Lenin, Mao used terror, imprisonment, and murder to exert authoritarian control over the populations. In the reality of the communist state, millions more under Stalin and Mao starved to death in failed schemes to eliminate private property. Another author, Jisheng, Jisheng, pointed out that Mao's China, there was no possibility of resistance under totalitarianism. He wrote, for the most part, people submitted. The exceptional people who opposed the system were usually crushed by it. In the face of a rigid political system, individual power was all but non-existent. The system was like a casting mold. No matter how hard the metal, once it was melted and poured into the mold, it came out the same shape as everything else. Regardless of what kind of person went into the totalitarian system, all came out as conjoined twins facing in opposite directions, either despot or slave, depending on their position, respective to those who were above or below them. So what you see here is the reality of communism. And we're going through right now a communist revolution in the United States, and we are being promised by the woke that this is social justice. It is not social justice. It is a perversion of social justice. It is blaming white supremacy, racism at the heart, male supremacy. They want to create this amorphic world in which the genders male and female come together, unisex, in which right and wrong come together, and such as you are beyond right and wrong. The God is viewed as a sky fairy that is non-existent. Families are viewed as rigid structures of social control designed to control the libido, the sexual impulses of the children, and to make boring the sexual impulses of the married couple. It's a materialistic view that says there is nothing here but the material that exists, and it is all, as Shakespeare said, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It's a very dark ideology, cleverly crafted to be psychologically seductive to those who are not trained to think creatively or to know history. Anyone versed in history knows that communism results in what the little black book predicts: misery for everyone who's subjected to it. Chris, any comments?
Back in 1917 and 1949, the weapons of the communists were the guns and propaganda and everything else. What we have now is major, or let's say mass media and the pen. That's what the weapons are right now as far as the Marxists and Stalinists of today, if you will, and Maoists.
Well, I mean, don't forget the Antifa enforcers,
Well,
and the Black
yes.
Lives Matters enforcers, and
Right.
the police that stood down to allow them to do it.
But with that, it's the media, it's the mass media that's sitting there telling you, we're trying to convince us that these are mostly peaceful protests and these people just want social justice. In fact, and anybody who protests on the other side for freedom or against such Marxist rule are deemed, oh, let's put it this way, terrorists. You know what happened in Ireland recently? There's that the immigrants stabbing of a child. It was an immigrant who stabbed a child to death. Finally, I'll just say the natives of were upset, and there was a riot. Well, the government denounced it. The media denounced it as a terrorist act. The prime minister was trying to shame publicly those who stood up against the policies that were being set, which wound up in the murder of a young child. And they showed no remorse about that young child.
The perpetrator was Algerian. He'd been in the country in Ireland for 20 years on government dole.
Right. Now, the idea is, well, they weren't the new batch. The problem is, again, you're bringing in people, you're not vetting them, and they're committing crimes.
Well, okay. The
Right.
fundamental issue
Right.
here, and you see the entire construction of this. That you've got the law enforcement agencies, Department of Justice, going after Donald Trump,
Right.
who wants to restore the Constitution and come back to fundamental values of family and God.
That's where we're going. Yes.
Okay, now the Department of Justice are protecting the Bidens and the Obamas and all the others who are, doing this fundamental transformation of America into a cultural Maoism, a cultural revolution of woke, to transform us into this neo-Marxism where uninhibited sexuality and pornography is the normal fare of our entertainment system, and God and families are ridiculed. They protect the oligarchs who are forming, the Khrushchevs, the Stalins, the Lenins, who are the Bidens and the Obamas, allowed to obtain enormous wealth through bribery, through corruption, which passes into the legislature. Mitch McConnell, his wife is Chinese. She's worth hundreds of millions of dollars in China. Their family in China wouldn't be allowed to live if Mitch McConnell wasn't aware of his obligation now to respect China's regards in the United States Senate, even as he is Senate Majority Leader. So the corruption and the penetration, the protection of this oligarchy, which would not hesitate to use violence to impose its will with hate crimes like is going on in Ireland and other countries, is following the same classic model of communism that we see in Russia and in China. And it will result in the same way.
Just a bit more sugar-coated. But the idea is anybody who speaks out against the established narrative, the Maoist narrative, the Marxist narrative here in the free world is deemed a terrorist. Heck, we talked about this before. Catholics who still prefer the Latin Mass are considered terrorists. Moms, a group of mothers who question the way their children are being educated, have been deemed a racist organization, and of course, terrorist.
Well, the state will now move to take children away from parents who do not agree to gender transformation surgery. But the point here is fundamental, that this is a failed system. Now, it has enormous seductive power, and it uses money to buy its way into power, and then it uses violence and terror to maintain its power. Now, the one aspect, and the reason I'm writing these books, is the one thing that defeats it is the truth.
Yes.
Now, the truth is that this, when people see what this results in, and, again, a biblical lesson to judge the tree by the fruit of the tree, when you see that what these people want you to do is eat bugs, can't eat meat, you can't travel, you can't be in airplanes because your carbon footprint's too big, you can't have a car because you might drive it into a city and where it's congested and have too much carbon dioxide being emitted. So you have to live in a 15-minute city where you get everywhere in 15 minutes by walking or bicycle. Limiting freedom. You can't hate speech. You can't have hateful speech against any other people because that's a crime. You can't call somebody a name. You can't hurt somebody's feelings because they may be insane schizophrenically and think that their sexuality is that of a dead 3 centuries old chicken. And you've got to respect that because that's who their gender identity is, regardless that it's insanity. So this insanity has to be judged. People have to say, wait a minute, we're not going there. We're not doing another lockdown. We're not going to be forced into another pandemic. We're not going to be taking the government's lies at face value any longer. And we're not going to be told stories that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Jack Kennedy. I'll be on that theme starting in the beginning of the year, maybe around December when the book is out. We're not going to take the government's narratives at face value. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, there weren't any. We never found one. The government will lie, and it will lie to cover up its lies, and then it will forbid any criticism of its lies. And that if it gets to that point, we've lost. So today is the day when Americans have to say no. And I'm going to wrap this up, Chris, with the going to God will win. God always wins. In the end, God always wins. God created this place. He can unplug it any day he wants. The cure, 2 Chronicles 7:14. We need to get down on our knees and beg God's forgiveness for not having opposed this Marxism more successfully going back to the 1940s. The McCarthy era has been ridiculed because of McCarthy's excesses. But in fact, the communist penetration of America has now become almost universal in our educational system. The intelligence agencies seem to have embraced it, the Justice Department. The effort to destroy America as a superpower and to the advancement of Russia and China, and especially China, validates Mao's idea that China would lead the world communist revolution. And the antagonism between Russia and China will again surface. But the point is, 2 Chronicles 7:14 says we will get a judgment of God, but God will hear our prayer and heal our land. Well, that healing of our land may be a judgment of God. I pray it will not have to go through another Great Depression or a nuclear war. But God is a just God, and these rules, violating God's rules, have consequences. It is not whatever you want it to be. You cannot imagine heaven and hell to be what you want, not that they don't exist or that what you want to be, or that God's going to forgive everything. There are consequences to life, and life is here. The only thing we get to take from here is our experience. So the only thing of value here is the experience. It's the only lasting thing. It's not transhumanism. It's not merging yourself with machines and supercomputers wired into your brain, or perpetual life extinction like Bill Gates and the others dream of for a small oligarchy. These concepts inherently are depopulationist. The rest of the people aren't needed, and there's no reason to keep them because there's no moral consideration of who a human being is. There's no appreciation of a spiritual nature or a nature that transcends into existence, which has moral consequences. So if we don't understand these concepts, they're not taught from the time children are born, we produce a race that is extremely destructive, and we're on that path right now. I still believe that we will get a judgment of God, but I think there'll be a reprieve. God will heal our land with that judgment. I do not believe God created human beings to fail. But it's going to take us understanding the mistakes made and our responsibility in those mistakes made to rectify the situation. In the end, God will win, and it would be incumbent upon each of us to be judged by the extent to which we were with God through this battle of principalities.